All right, we are together.
Ashe, honey. Yay. Okay. I am Camellia Dowling McDermott-Lee. I am the descendant of the Lee and the Lin lineages of Fujian and Kinmen and Nyali, and the McGowan, McDermott, Macaulay, Garrett, Suit, and Lloyd folks. I am a beneficiary of white supremacist land theft and genocide. And that's why I am here to try and practice imperfectly, but consistently, accountability for my complicity in structural oppression.
And I am Brendan Curran, Celtic, Gaelic, Irish descent, Currans, Flins, I think there's some Reedies in there, Cajun, Acadian descent. Also, we have Borks. And I grew up on occupied Wampanoag land.
A shame.
And I am living on the land, occupied land of the Tuolumne Band of the Kalapuya Nation.
A shame. And I was born on Kumeyaay land. I'm currently on Tongva land, educated on Okinichi, Sapuni, Tuscarora, Narragansett, and Wampanoag land. And I called Brendan yesterday. Oh my God, because there is a lot of like escalated but very deep-rooted violence, like the continued unceasing genocidal attacks on people of African descent and people of indigenous descent seem to be like amplified. Not new, but particularly acute, and also because a lot of loved ones and community folks who are important to me, I have seen re-traumatized by the vicious murder of Ahmaud Arbery and the disestablishment of Mashpee Wampanoag lands 400 years after literally saving the Pilgrims from dying over the winter, and witnessing how settler and white and non-Black inaction or trying to explain away and invalidate the anger and trauma is a form of violence, not as overt as the white men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery with guns, but is what makes it possible for them to do that and still be walking around unarrested.
I really appreciated your suggesting that we have a public conversation about all the injustice that's going on right now, Camellia, and also specifically how whiteness perpetuates that injustice, and how all the injustice is built on this sick idea of whiteness. And the system of privilege called whiteness. And because all the injustice that's taking place right now is really enough to make a person want to scream or cry or so many things. And to not make space for that, to give language to that is, and space for that is oppressive, and we need to give space for that, all the feeling, and there needs to be some truth telling and acknowledgement. So normally, under normal circumstances, I feel like we would be able to protest or demonstrate and we can't do that right now. So having a public conversation is a way of doing that, of standing up. I really want to echo what you said. I just share so much your sentiment that especially at this time, well, first of all, I kind of want to name everything that's going on today.
Yes, that's right.
We're in the flower moon, the last supermoon of 2020, in what in my ancestral Catholic tradition was the month of Mary. So I want to just celebrate our mothers and the love of our mothers, all of our, and also of women and all of our trans femme brothers and sisters and people who have the feminine within them. I just want to celebrate that spirit. And I just want to, I envision Ahmaud Arbery just in the arms of the mother right now. And I want to envision all of our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters and all the people of color who are victimized by the violence of white supremacy and our current corporate fascist white supremacist establishment that continues to colonize, that continues to do violence. And it's important that I think it's important as someone who walks with white cis male privilege, even though I don't identify as all of those identity markers, I acknowledge that I still walk with white cis male privilege. And I just think it's important for people who walk with that privilege to speak out right now, because it's all too predictable how the white establishment media and white institutions will so predictably start. I imagine it's predictable that these institutions will start trying to somehow make the violence done to Ahmaud Arbery somehow gray, when it's not gray at all. It will also try to do the same with the act of genocide being perpetuated by the current neo-fascist administration against the Wampanoag Nation. It's 2020, and the Wampanoag Nation, who are the original people of the part of Turtle Island that I grew up on, Massachusetts, they were the first to welcome the Pilgrims and save them in that first winter. And then the following winter, the story that isn't told is they were systematically slaughtered by the same group. And the rest is the history, the ongoing legacy of genocide that is, I would like to think it wouldn't be continuing in 2020, but here we are in 2020, and the current administration, the current establishment disestablished their lands. They're taking away their lands.
It's like 321 acres too. It's so small. Like pretty much all of what's now called Wampanoag should be. And instead of all it's called Massachusetts, it's the level of just disgusting greed is like breathtaking.
It's beyond. It's ridiculous. There really aren't words to describe the injustice or to sum it up, are there?
No, yeah, like there aren't words that can wrap it up. But like I think it's important to name that you and I have been like talking about, like, would this be performative and centering us? And I mean, it could be, but we've been in discussion about how white and non-Black silence. I am like I'm a very multi-heritage person, but any African ancestry is like hundreds of years back, and I don't face the racial profiling, and I'm not going to be murdered for my pigmentation. So I benefit from anti-Black racism, that the silence and the defensiveness and the explaining away and all of that chicanery, all of that nonsense is the foundation that allows those Travis and George, I think were their names, those murderers, to kill. It's the substrata. And so, like, I believe it was Angela Davis, forgive me, Mama, if I'm misquoting the wrong person, but that, like, it's not enough to be non-racist. One has to be anti-racist. And so, like, actively right now, we can just talk on the internet and not safely.
Invite people into that conversation, yeah.
Yeah, and like, I think another element that is important and why we thought maybe we could be of service is that Brendan and I have both spent years trying to work the ancestral piece. Like, we were not always settlers. Everybody has ancestors who are indigenous to some part of this planet at some point. And there's oh my God, I loved how, Brendan, you talked about whiteness as blankness. And there's this lie that, like, to be white is, like, I hear folks talk about, like, oh, I don't have a culture, I don't have an identity, because it's part of this exchange. For a cut of, like, honestly, the blood money, literally, like, there's no historical ambiguity about the fact that millions of Native and Black folks have died in order to build this country. Like, this land, Native folks have to be dead and or pushed off of it for us to live here, to establish businesses. And like, the economy in the beginning of this nation state was an export economy of raw materials, at least in the US South, through, like, through dehumanizing, genocidal exploitation, and on a sort of, like, labor class analysis, like, not paying slavery is, like, unpaid labor. And it's also dehumanizing, genocide, inexcusable. But, like, the wealth that, like, I can trace from the Macaulays and the Suits and the Garretts and the Lloyds, like, they have settled Occaneechi-Saponi, Tuscarora land in what's now called North Carolina for the past several hundred years. And part of that had to do with the money that has been passed down in that part of my lineage came from exploiting Black folks. And so if I open, like, Santander or, like, Capital One, and I look at my bank account, those dollars come from Occaneechi-Saponi, Tuscarora people being pushed off their land, and people of African descent being forced to extract value from that earth. And that's what George Lipsitz calls the wages of whiteness. And one easy, like, emotional trap that people who are beneficiaries of structural oppression can get stuck in is guilt. And that's a paralyzing force. It's not an activating catalytic force. Guilt and defensiveness. And also then a sense of, like, the loss of, like, oh, I don't have a culture, I don't have an identity. What is my identity if I'm not white? And whiteness means, like, superior to Blackness. That's, like, how it was constructed socially. And long-winded way, what I'm getting at is that both Brendan and I have been doing a lot of, like, ancestral excavation shadow work to, like, what comes before? What did we give up in order to become white? And that is often an ancestral connection that actually is life-giving, not to the not to the jerks, because everybody has some jerks in our families, and folks of descendants of structurally advantaged people, we often have maybe a bit more of jerks in our families, but there is a way to access ancestral strength from those souls, those forebears who did have good character, who did have good hearts, and to call on that and to connect on to that, and from there build an identity where one can sustainably act in solidarity, not coming from a place of like, oh, I'm so sorry, or like, I don't know who I am, which tends, I think, to keep folks stuck in this like navel gazing, frozen place that is not suitable, not conducive to mobilization. And I'd love to hear anything that you think about that.
You said so much, Camelia, that is just so true. I think I want to talk a little bit about, I think I want to model what I think people with white privilege have to say to other people with white privilege. And in that, I want to just talk a little bit about what I think this concept of whiteness allows for. And I think that if there's going to be justice, if we can arrive at a way of being that is mutual, that is whole, that's restorative, where people live in harmony with each other, where there's unity and diversity among each other, and harmony between people and also this earth, this hurting, wounded earth, we have to get rid of whiteness. And people might be shocked when they hear this, but nobody is really white. And when I say that, I don't want to say that people don't, I don't want to, that's not me not acknowledging the fact that white privilege exists. And it's this, I think that it has its origins in the Crusades. That's my theory about it. This sort of, but really, how does it manifest itself? It basically is, whiteness itself is privilege. It erases language, erases culture, erases connection to ancestor, and I like to call it blankness, because really it's not about color or ethnicity, or well, it is about color, but it's not about ethnicity or ancestor or culture. It's about getting rid of all of those things to leave someone as with the only identity it leaves people left with is being a consumer, and a privileged consumer, sort of the best consumer, I guess, or at least having the idea of that. And I want to talk about how, as long as we have this concept of whiteness, people who walk with white, and I would also add to that white cis male privilege, are going to remain in a spiritual void. They're going to remain in a spiritual void, because if there's no acknowledgement of how we are benefiting from an ongoing legacy of a slave economy constructed on the genocide of indigenous peoples, we are not going to have love in our hearts. We're not going to be able to have true joy, because we're not going to be able to have truly healthy relationships. If we can't name that reality and name what's going on around us, we cannot be spiritually healthy people. We'll have
all of us.
that
slow or fast.
yeah, and I I guess I want to. I guess this is me getting a little bit Old Testament, but I want to damn and rebuke a few things. It's so predictable. As a white privileged person, I know that it's so predictable. Growing up in a predominantly white suburb, uh, living in predominantly white communities throughout my life, moving through predominantly white institutions. Uh, when something awful like like when something awful like what happened to Ahmaud Arbery happens, rather than acknowledge how this is a modern lynching,
Yes.
there's a tendency to want to make it gray. And how's this for gray? Most of white privileged people's ancestors made a sport out of lynching. And maybe they don't want to look at that. Maybe they don't know how to look at that. Is the grief too big, I wonder? Or, I think the grief around that is probably a positive thing. But,
yeah.
But I think but that goes back to whiteness. Whiteness is the entitlement to be able to not feel that,
Yeah.
and also the narcissism that wants to be defensive in the face of atrocity and tragedy. The narcissism that wants to somehow make atrocity other than what it actually is. We need to rebuke that. We need to put that away. It's 2020. We cannot have that anymore. And I also want to talk about the entitlement of, I'm a minister in a church. I hear so many white privileged ministers wonder, well, if I call this what it is, how are people going to respond? Who cares? We need to tell the truth about what this is, which is it's a modern lynching. We need to tell the clear truth about what's happening to the Mashpee Wampanoag, which is ongoing genocide.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way to sugarcoat this. White privileged people should not be afforded the luxury of sugarcoating things or making things other than what they are. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just want to damn the privilege that allows and rebuke the privilege in the name of love, in the name of Jesus and all the forces of goodness that I know from my traditions, and all of the positive spirits and all of everything that is good and beautiful and right in this universe. We need to rebuke that and banish it. And I say, so I'm speaking from my own spiritual tradition in that respect. I'm so impatient with the unwillingness, white privileged people's unwillingness to look at these things. And we know that, and I also want to talk about the media, because I can only imagine what the corporate media mainstream media is going to be doing with this. And I want to qualify what I'm about to say, because, the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels said, accuse your enemy of that which you're guilty. Mm. And the fact of the matter is that cable media has been owned by 6 major corporations for a long time, and the quality of cable media journalism has been poor for a while.
Yeah.
We need independent media sources. We need public journalism that tells the stories of what's really going on. So much of cable media journalism is punditry that tells the story of the conquerors, that upholds the narrative of the conquerors, which is inherently white supremacist.
Yes.
And so oftentimes when you critique, I preface that because when the current administration called cable media journalism fake news and sowed seeds of confusion, they were accusing their enemy of that which they're guilty. Because we need to be able to call the cable media journalism networks that make stories like what happened to Ahmaud Arbery gray. We need to call them out for the racist, neo-fascist propaganda networks that they are. And you know, and I remember, and I want to specifically say that about Fox. All cable media, I think, could use improvement, but there's no filthier network than Fox. I remember when the racist woman, Ann Coulter, said hallelujah when George Zimmerman was acquitted of the murder of Trayvon Martin. Well, as a person who strives to let the love of God live in my heart, I want to say that word hallelujah to be ashes in her mouth. And I guess I want to say that, but I guess it's so important that people with white privilege come out and publicize these conversations and have conversations about accountability right now, because we know all too predictably that a white supremacist narrative, a white privilege narrative will try to make this story gray. And we need to stand alongside of our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters, and also our Asian American brothers and sisters who are being victimized by racist violence because of the racist, violent rhetoric of the current racist, neo-fascist regime in place right now. We need to speak out against it. We need to speak out against it firmly and with righteous indignation and with all the love of humanity in our hearts. And we need to say to, and white privileged people, needs to be silent and listen and ask questions about what repair means and look like. What does repair look like? How do we walk into and live into repair after centuries of an ongoing slave economy built on genocide? How do we even take steps towards repair?
Yeah, babe.
On that note, on the note of white privileged people being silent and listening, I'm going to be silent and listen.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think what I bring is the non-Black person of color point, where like it's a really easy sort of trap to fall into, to like to stay in like a one-dimensional identity. So yes, like I have experiences of racialization. I have melanin. Interestingly, that's culturally contingent. When I go to Brazil, I am white, particularly because I have US citizenship. Here, this is a country that there were a lot of European settlers, so the construction of white racial identity became the one-drop rule, the law of hypodescent, Plessy versus Ferguson. In Brazil, where 40% of the Afro-descendant people who survived the transatlantic chattel slavery trade, white people trafficked so many folks there that a huge majority of people, as yet uncounted and documented in Brazil, are of African descent. So they codified whiteness on color to make it so that if folks were mobilizing by one drop rule in Brazil, then like it's very because it's not documented that way, we don't know the data, but like there to be white in Brazil, it's different. I'm white there. Here I am not, but I benefit from anti-Blackness. The story that I always go back to that demonstrates that so clearly is when Li Ting Qian and Su Chin Lin Li, my paternal grandparents, came to North Carolina. And my grandpa was doing like a residency, a postdoc, one of those many things that people on a medical path do. And it was in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Jim Crow. So they were in some public space and needed to use the restroom, and there were the white and the colored restrooms, and they didn't know what to do because they didn't fall into either Afro-descendant or European descendant categories. And the like very metaphorical end to that story is that they asked the kind of like their guide that the hospital had assigned to my grandpa, who's a pediatrician, said, oh, you go in the white one. So that's part of like a historical context that goes back to, like, I'm glad that you named the Crusades, because we're talking centuries upon centuries of historical context, like that whiteness is constructed on just many layers, but partly on, and very fundamentally on, like, particularly people of African descent not being human. Mm-hmm. And so there's this nuance and layered work that non-Black people of color that we need to do, and that I invoke and call upon us to do, where like I know that folks who look like my grandparents, folks who look like my dad, are getting acid thrown on them, are getting violently attacked right now for having almond eyes, for showing that they come from the Asian continent. And so there's a place where I need to be in like mobilization against white supremacy as someone who is like violently targeted by it, but I am not its primary target. And that, like, I'm just thinking back to the 1200s. Sylvia Wynter is this amazing Jamaican theorist who articulated what you expressed, Brendan. She talks about how originally this the construct of what it means to be a human being was, she calls it man one, and that was to be human was to be Christian. And so then you have a couple papal bulls, which is where like the Pope issues a decree and says, oops, I'm sorry, there's traffic outside, says this is what's up. So there were a couple papal bulls
appropriately called papal bull.
Oh, I always thought it was papal. Yes, yeah, that right. Where they said, like, there's a couple things. One was where I think it was Dum Diversus. There's a papal bull that says, like, it is acceptable to reduce non-Christian people and their descendants to eternal servitude because they're not Christian. And to be Christian is to be human. And then there's a papal bull even more horrific, saying that actually the Pope encourages Catholic rulers to do this. And so this is the time in Europe when the church, capital C, is like the most powerful entity on that continent. And this, you've got the Inquisition, you've got the burning of women, the Green Witches, the lineage keepers of traditional medicine. All of that is happening along with the Crusades. And then Sylvia Wynter talks about this transition to merchant capitalism, which you were articulating, of like, oh, then the identity is the consumer. And she calls that man too. And where like the power shifts away from these like hereditary monarchies, which are tied into the Catholic Church, and it becomes this merchant capitalist thing where your access to money is what gives you meaning and what gives you humanity. But it's still got that Christian and non-Christian divide underneath, which is not innate to what the man himself, Christ, said, like, there's no scripture talking about like anyone who doesn't follow me isn't human. Like an oppressive invention attached onto the legacy of that human being, that prophet. But like all of that, we're living now, so that 2020, we're living in this longue durée timeline of centuries of decisions about what it means to be human that have morphed and morphed, and where people have been fighting it for centuries since the beginning. And
I just want to say, you should not have to go to college or get a master's degree to know that this country has systemically tried to negotiate people's humanity since its inception. Like, we don't learn that Black people were considered 3/5 of a person in elementary school. I mean, maybe some elementary school teachers teach that, but in general, we don't learn Black history. We don't learn Indigenous history. We certainly don't really learn the history of the labor movement with much integrity. And, you know, if we did, we would also learn that most revolutionary movements in this country that gained success happened when people were starting to organize across all of those lines. And that's when things really get squashed fast.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I want to talk a bit about, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, babe.
Oh, I guess I want to
Go ahead, love.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what I've learned, an interesting perspective I have on whiteness that I learned from being the child of an immigrant. As I mentioned, my ancestry on my mother's side is Cajun. And they have an interesting history because they were the earliest French settler colonists who came here, but they set up an alliance with the Mi'kmaq and lived very symbiotically and mutually with the Mi'kmaq for hundreds of years. Later French settlers came, and then the British came and expelled them. And they went, and then those settlers went to Louisiana, and in Louisiana, the word Acadiense became Cajun. On my father's side, my dad is an immigrant from Ireland, from North Kerry. And so with the Irish American perspective, things that I see right now that give me hope, that I think are examples of what it looks like when white privileged people do their ancestral healing work.
Okay.
The Irish in Ireland, of course, have kept their land-based narratives and folklore, stories, traditions intact through centuries of British colonialism. The struggle to keep the language, the Irish language, intact is an ongoing struggle through centuries of colonialism. But if you look at Bobby Sands, who's the anniversary of Bobby Sands' death happened a couple days ago. On May 5th, he died in prison fighting British colonialism under the oppression of Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. He died in 1981 on a hunger strike. A lot of Irish people in Ireland, anyway, know, remember, and celebrate how our movement, our resistance to British colonialism, and the racism that we experienced as Gaelic Irish people at the hands of colonizing English people and British landlords and the oppression we experienced, our resistance to that was directly informed by Black and Indigenous resistance in this country, in the United States, for centuries. Frederick Douglass visited Ireland at the time when the Irish were referred to as N-words turned inside out. That's what Irish people were called in this country. Also, the Eamon de Valera received funds from, I believe it was the Northern Cheyenne, but he visited them when he was trying to make alliances with foreign allies during the Irish War for Independence. Indigenous nations during the hunger, which were the famine years, which was really an act of genocide, because it's not that there was enough food for people to have, or their food could have been distributed to the starving Irish, but the famine was seen as an opportunity to depopulate the land. But the Choctaw Nation sent corn and saved the lives of many Irish people during that time. And Irish people in Ireland keep the knowledge, the stories of those old alliances alive. A monument was built to the Choctaw Nation, and currently the Irish Republic and people in Ireland, there's a large campaign of sending money to the Dene Nation right now. As we all know, I also want to acknowledge that currently, the current administration, who's only interested in keeping the engine of capital going right now at the expense of so many people's lives, don't care about the coronavirus affecting people, because it's poor people who are suffering as a result of this virus. It's Black and Indigenous people who are the most intensely affected by this coronavirus. And the fact that in this time, the current administration is silencing the head of the Center for Disease Control, tabling safety standards for how to phase forward safely right now, we have to basically see that as a current expression of a current manifestation of what smallpox blankets were.
Yes, yes. Make that connection. Same genocidal germ warfare.
Yep.
400 years.
Yep.
We are.
And I think that, but I'm glad that Irish people in Ireland, anyhow, are sending money towards to the Navajo Nation, to the Dene, and to other Indigenous nations who are affected. I think that's an example of how people behave how white privileged people behave when they've done their ancestral healing work and when they actually acknowledge history. I wish Irish American people would do the same. And I want to say, my uncle Michael, who's an Irish speaker, I'm happy to say, and learned some from him. And I've learned some things about our ancestry from him. He shared with me once, when they were in Ireland, they didn't go around calling themselves white. This is something that happened when they came to America. And Irish people obviously became white in this country, and currently are beneficiaries of white privilege. My wish, my hope, is that Irish Americans would actually, I want to name that very often we see Irish Americans not connecting their history of oppression and resistance to a need to be in solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities and people of color here now. They usually say, well, I suffered, so other people they have this attitude of like buying into the meritocracy, and other people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which is a racist narrative.
Yeah.
And so too often we see Irish Americans buying into white supremacy, upholding white supremacy. It's certainly what we saw in Boston in the 70s during the desegregation of schools. It's what I saw right here in the state of Oregon driving around the other day. I saw the Irish tricolor flying right above and next to the segregationist flag of the South. It made me, I could not possibly have been more disgusted coming from a family who was, involved in the Irish struggle against colonialism and the war for independence. Actually, one of the worst atrocities of the Irish Civil War happened in the house that basically across the street from the house that my father grew up in, and it was my great grandmother who saved the survivor of that atrocity, the only survivor of that atrocity. That's another story. But I think it's important for white people to do their ancestral healing work and connect whatever experience of being connected to a history of resistance and oppression. We need to connect that to the oppression that's happening to Black and Indigenous communities here, and at least aspire towards solidarity. I don't know, I have to say, as a white privileged person, I don't know really how to be in solidarity, what solidarity means fully, what repair looks like fully. I mean, as we stand in just the wreckage of what has been done for so many centuries, I don't know how it's possible, but my faith, my spirituality, requires that I wonder. And I think that faith, spirituality, morality, conviction should motivate all white privileged people to do that.
Ashe. Yeah, I just want to I found the names of the murderers of Ahmaud who hunted him down and killed him. Their names are Gregory and Travis McMichael. And the fact that there's that Mick prefix concerns me, and there's another part I think I forgot to mention of why I wanted to talk about this, because they may have Irish ancestors. Sure, and with McMichael as the name.
Yeah, that would probably be Scotch Irish, but Irish nonetheless.
Yeah.
He's a former police officer, and I'd like to talk about the history of how the Irish became cops.
Ooh, okay, yeah, let's do it.
I want to talk about how the police force in this country is an intrinsically white supremacist institution that has a legacy and a history attached to it. Because he was a former police officer, which is also the injustice inherent in that system is also connected to the heinous injustice that this man has not been brought to justice still. And can we imagine, if we flip the script for just a moment, if we saw Black people hunting down a 25-year-old, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white jogger and shot him down like a dog in broad daylight? I mean, what a savage act. What a savage, violent act. And if it were Black men doing that to a white person right now, then the Klan
would ride. The Klan would kill like entire villages. The Klan would go out and ride and kill people.
And let's talk about the Klan. We see the Klan as these cave dwellers who are storming the Capitol building with arms, standing on the steps of the state Capitol, fully armed.
Yeah, and they're not protesters, they're terrorists. That was an important distinction I saw in a meme. Like, that's not protest. That's not protest.
The current administration has empowered and emboldened neo-fascists and the Klan to take off their hoods.
The Klan literally celebrated when he won. They publicly were happy.
And we have to remember that this current administration celebrated how there are some good Nazis and some good people.
You're right.
They're not good people among the Ku Klux Klan. They're not good fascists. They're not good people among Nazis. They're evil. And the level of the vile ignorance and hate we see openly, unafraid to display themselves. They are moving on a trajectory of violence. I mean, we see them unafraid to just be armed publicly, these white racists, you know, unashamed to display their anger, their violence, their racist ignorance, uh, on display in public. And we have to not, and I want to talk about how white privileged people feel like there's some need to be polite to these people in the name of a false unity, in the name of upholding a lousy peace. Well, that apathy, that desire for a lousy peace, that desire to uphold unity over doing good, over doing the right thing, is as violent as going out and actually committing the violence.
Yeah, there's kind of like, so, sorry, babe. I think what I'm seeing, and you know what, there's probably a Black person, Indigenous person who has like conceptualized this. So I'm not going to say that I invented this, but what I'm sort of visualizing is like an iceberg. So at the top, you've got the Klan riders who like wear their hoods, the people who openly have the Confederate flag out, the people who murder folks, like the very obvious expressions of overt supremacist genocidal violence that a lot of like mainstream folks, mainstream privileged people feel comfortable condemning. But underneath is below the waters, and we're in a Scorpio moon, and the Scorpio to me has all of this energy of like diving deep and looking at the hidden. There is what consists of that violence, and it's like there's all these levels. So like the willingness, the feeling of safety, like that these men felt safe and felt like they could go out and commit murder in broad daylight, documented, and walk free. That's possible because all of these substrates, and there's like the apologism, what you've touched on, like, oh, there must be some gray. There's and then there's there like, and where the media is involved, and the discourses and the narratives that obscure and try to cover things up with a polite civil lie. And there's my PC just said it ran into a problem and needs to restart. But on the other side, I also really have to go to the bathroom. So I'm going to use the restroom, and I think my PC will restart, and I'll hop back on.
We are recording again. I think that there might be an interlude, but I think we're back.
Yeah, I see you, I hear you. Basically, I was thinking like you and I don't know, I hope so, but I don't think that we are going to be able to call in the active white supremacists or those who apologize for their racism. Like those folks are not probably going to hear us. I hope so. It doesn't strike me as very likely. But then other parts of this iceberg of white supremacy, it's white and it can take us all down, drown us, are like folks who are at a different stage of like maybe not apologizing, but maybe being in a place of feeling like feeling sad, feeling guilty, feeling scared, and being stuck in that place. And one thing that's very important, like you and I have been talking about shadow work, which I think we're probably referencing Jung or whatever, like basically doing internal self-reflection on feelings that are hard. But there's a racial justice element to shadow work where a lot of times white folks and just basically any person who's in an identity position that is privileged, whether that's like straight folks in relation to queer folks or cisgender folks in relation to trans folks, there's this tendency for us to, when we're in that space of like guilt, anger, fear, sadness, all of those yucky feelings, when we're okay, I'm willing to look at the fact that I'm complicit in this situation that is antithetical to my morals, and oops, looks like I'm not the hero, looks like I'm actually on the villain side. Like people get stuck, and there's this work that has to be done on our feelings. And it is a racial justice practice to take responsibility for that work and to not externalize it. Because then an easy way to, again, be racist or to be transphobic or be homophobic on whatever axis of privilege is to try and make the person who is on the receiving end of oppression make me feel better. If I want Black folks to absolve me and tell me, oh, but you're good, like, or try to get someone else to take away the guilt, to like, and I often see this, like it's the Crunk Feminist Collective talks a lot about emotional labor, affective labor, like trying to get Black folks or queer folks or whoever to be the therapist to deal with the uncomfortable emotional internal experience of that shadow work. And it is a racial justice act to say, no, oh shit, this is my work. And then I think one way that you and I can both be of service is, given that we are both in the process of doing that work and we will continue to be doing that work our whole lives, perfectly, imperfectly, messing up all the time, but continuing to come back to it, is by sharing some of our experience in doing that work, because that's what needs to happen in order to get to the other side, to get to a place of action, to get to the place where we can be leveraging these unearned privileges and powers, the fact that people are going to listen to me, but not to my friend who I grew up with because of the lighter color of my skin, that is actually an asset. That's a resource that needs to be leveraged in solidarity, not me like taking the mic and standing in front, but it's a resource that I need to be finding a way to redistribute to folks who don't have it. So I'd love to hear sort of you talking a little bit about that, that unpacking shadow work, which you and I both connect very much to ancestral lineage searching.
Well, I think that that's sort of why I brought up the Irishness thing, because I've been guilty at different times myself, is trying to say, oh, but Irish people, but Irish people were oppressed too, and or but my dad was an immigrant and I'm new here, and you know, as a white privileged person, I've definitely had to look at, I always am trying to look at my own defensiveness of kind of wanting to say, but I'm not a bad person. And it's like, it's not about individually you being a bad person. It's about being honest about the oppressive, institutionally oppressive and violent systems in which we live, and and under those systems, and it also doesn't mean that people who have white privilege don't experience oppression in other ways. For instance, I'm a gay, non-binary person, a fae spirit, and so that is something that I've experienced oppression around that. Whiteness, or the color of my skin is not something for which that is not a reason that I have experienced oppression, and actually, it's a point through which I access privilege, and the privilege that I have connected with that is built on the exists on the exploitation of people in communities of color. As you mentioned, you called it the wages of whiteness. I thought.
Yeah, George Lipsitz wrote a whole book about it.
Right.
Really recommend it.
And so, rather than look at my ancestral narrative and have it be a defensive thing, I think it's important that the ancestral narrative inform action here and now and inform the effort of trying to dismantle systems that oppress here and now. And if we're trying to dismantle systems of oppression here and now, we cannot afford to have any hesitation of naming white supremacy where and when it expresses itself, and also understanding the complexity of white supremacy. I'm glad you named that system, the pyramid, the iceberg that you talked about, because too many white privileged people think that white supremacy is just saying the N-word and walking around in a hood and burning a cross on somebody's lawn. And
yeah, it's like, don't do that, but also there's other stuff you need to know.
Not that it's
be doing.
Yes, don't do that, but also right, but also it's having the luxury of just thinking your perspective is the same as everyone else's. Your experience is the same as everyone else's. You just have the freedom to take whatever you want, to go wherever you want, to never have to ask permission. It's so many things. And it's white people need to be willing to take a moral inventory, and also to be critical of oneself and to be curious. I mean, we talked about the void that whiteness creates. I have wondered, how do we fill that void? And I think that we fill that void with a humble curiosity, a willingness to listen, a willingness to ask more questions. And I think white privileged people really have to say, if you find yourself problematizing Black rage or the pain, problematizing the pain or tone policing people in community of colors, people in communities of color,
you got it.
you have to, how about instead asking, why aren't you problematizing that which is morally outrageous? Why are you problematizing rage instead of that which is morally outrageous? That's what I think, that it would be nice to see, moral outrage with what is morally outrageous, from communities who benefit from white privilege.
Yeah, it's always, there's this intentional historical forgetting. His last name is Trujillo. He wrote oh goodness me. Okay, this is showing that I remember the last names of authors. Trujillo. He wrote about the importance of memory. He talked about silencing the past. Yes, Silencing the Past is the book, right? So he talks about memory and forgetting, and I think it's always important to name Black theorists, and for that intellectual labor. but yeah, so he talks about forgetting, and there's this historical forgetting about like and rewriting of narratives of the past that is very strategic, that upholds injustice. And to make it really like make it really clear, you gave the example of like of the Irish narrative, and how like it's possible to connect that lineage and history of resistance to solidarity today. And there's this way of remembering the past and telling the story of the past that can create agency for folks like me who are beneficiaries of injustice. And there's and that's a critical that's critical inner work to be doing right now, to avoid the yucky phenomenon that I see of like white privileged folks turning like centering the narrative around ourselves and being like and doing navel gazing about like, oh, I don't know where I come from, and like I don't have a culture. And the reality is, no, like literally everywhere Scandinavian people have masquerades, like there's maypoles, that is super pagan. Like every culture probably had some animal sacrifice somewhere, paid attention to the cycles of the moon, made some kind of sacrifice to avoid like getting eaten by a predator. Like that's a human thing. There are prayers, there are languages, there is folklore, there is a tribal identity based on lineage for everybody. And the strategic forgetting of it was a way to get capital, literally to get money, to get land, to get resources based on greed. And it's there, and it's possible to find it. And like, and that's the work. That is one of the things to do, rather than getting stuck in, I don't know what to do, I feel so bad. Like getting into action. There can be a genealogical search, like where is somebody? It can be like some of my work with my European ancestry is like going back to, I mean, when were the Bria laws? It was like 400 Common Era. It's a long time ago.
People who are watching and wondering, they might be wondering what the Brian laws were. Those were the Gaelic laws that enshrined, ownership is really the wrong word, but collective sharing in the abundance of the earth.
Okay.
And most of the rituals of Celtic spirituality were around negotiating relationship between people and the earth. And I think whatever our spirituality or our faith is, or whatever our pathway is, I think part of healing is establishing right relationship to the people around us, and also to the earth, like making sure like the relationships are mutual, reciprocal.
I say
that we can access the wisdom that allows us to do that. And by exploring our ancestries, like you said, is a great way to start that. Speaking of looking at history, I did want to mention the origin of the police force. I didn't finish that. It's such a juicy conversation. The first slave patrols were, at least in the colonies, the original 13 colonies, were made up of Irish indentured servants, mostly Irish indentured servants, who were brought here as indentured servants by colonizers. And they pitted them against Black people who were made into slaves, who were brought here and enslaved. And they were told that if you catch runaway slaves, you can have your freedom from indentured servitude.
Oh my God.
So it created an incentive for these Irish indentured servants to be slave patrols, form slave patrols. And and then catch runaway slaves. And these slave patrols became the first police forces in the colonies, because we forget just how we're in a war economy right now. Well, it was a slave economy then. Like, so so the police force was the slave patrol, and vice versa. So I remember when, as I was growing up, as I was learning more about Irish American identity. Well, actually, my father, who's directly from Ireland, used to say, "You're not Irish American. You're Irish. We're Irish. You're an Irish citizen, and we're from County Kerry. But I was kind of scratching my head, feeling like, well, I'm growing up in Danvers, Massachusetts. This is America. I certainly feel Irish American. So, but I think that he was embarrassed, actually, as an Irish immigrant from the Republic, uh, of the racist behavior of Irish Americans. And learning about Irish identity and Irish traditions and culture from my family, I did grow up kind of scratching my head, wondering, well, if this is what it means to be Irish, why are so many Irish Americans into being white and racist? Flatly. It's a pretty racist bunch. And I think, not to generalize, but I think that Irish Americans have a lot of work to do. And as all white privileged groups and peoples have a lot of work to do. But I think that story about, and of course the Irish American cop has become almost an archetype for racism in this country. And as we see it, and here we see it manifesting in the form of, this monster who is a former cop who's guilty of the savage killing of Ahmaud Arbery. He's an Irishman, and he's an insult to our ancestors. And I hope he's brought to justice. I hope that there is justice. But we all white privileged people have to ask, where did he come from?
Yes.
Where did all of these angry, beleaguered, violent people with guns, who are Nazi sympathizers and Klan sympathizers, and probably actual Klansmen, on the steps, some of them, on the steps of our state capitals, where did these angry, misinformed, miseducated, violent people come from? And we have to educate ourselves, we have to educate each other, and we have to fix this. We have to turn around. The word repent means to turn around. White privileged people.
Etymology.
White privileged people need to turn around. And I want to talk about turning around. I have friends in the Afro-diasporic religions who practice them. And I've continued to learn about the beauty of the wisdom in these traditions. And one of the concepts that my friend Gail Burton shared with me, who you know Gail, is the concept of Sankofa, which is you have to look back in order to go forward. Well, I think that white privileged people have to do that too, in the work of eradicating whiteness and all the oppression and spiritual death that comes with it.
Yes, it's a death bunker. Like, it kills along so many levels. Like, I loved how you were talking about in the Berea laws, this like wisdom tradition, earth-centered, relationship-based stewardship on the continent of Europe, like, across the strait, whatever. Like that, cutting those relationships, that serves capitalism. So racialized capitalism extracts value. Like John Trudeau, rest in peace, he talks about like mining people, like So you cut people away from their relationship to the land. You cut people away from their relationship to their ancestors. You cut men, people assigned at birth as male, you cut them away from their access to their feelings, to vulnerability. Cut sexuality away from everything except for taboo and procreation. Like there's all of these ways, cutting the life force that is inherent in relationality, and with that cutting, channeling that light force into maximum profit. Cutting away knowledge of any identity other than supremacy. And like you and I have circled, I think this is a very Gaelic thing. It's at least the way my mind works, like little spirals back and forth, connecting to associations, ancient, future. That's just how I work. But like one of the themes we've been spiraling around, yeah, in the Triskel is about the spiritual death, and how this blankness, literally cutting us off from our ancestors, and like, oh, you don't have a tribal name, you don't have a language, you are just white, you are blank, you are superior to others, and you consume, and that's all you are. That is a soul death. It is literally actively murdering Black and Indigenous people, and it is also slowly and spiritually killing us. Like there's this beautiful book by Aisha Belisu de Jesus, and she it's Electric Santeria. And she's a scholar at Harvard Divinity School. And one of the things that stuck with me in that book, Electric Santeria, is where she talks about somebody went into trance in a Lukumi Santeria context and said, the bourgeoisie sacrificed their children. Like spirit came and said that. And so like all of that cutting away from who you were before whiteness, cutting away all of these, that does very like spiritual damage to our ability to connect to anyone else, to connect to land, to love, and I mean, I would really question if there's anything that makes life worth living besides love, and being like sacrificing our ability to love, sacrificing our ancestral connection. So we've got these wandering in Chinese Taoism, we would talk maybe about hungry ghosts, guilo, who are like lost and voracious and never satiated. Like it's killing everybody. It's killing Indigenous and Black people fast. It's killing white people slowly. It's killing our planet. It is endangering our species, because racialized capitalism is also based on extracting maximum profit from the earth and thus killing it so that we can't live here anymore. And we might, like, it's actively leading us towards extinction. It is a death machine that, both altruistically, because it is evil to kill other people, to be killing Black people, to be stealing Indigenous people's lands, but also selfishly, we cannot afford to continue with whiteness, with white racialized capitalism, settler colonial, this like nasty assemblage, because it is endangering our future. Our kids might not have a planet. We have to stop it for life itself.
Yep.
Yeah.
Ashe. I want to talk about how also, speaking of looking back to sort of find this wisdom that grounds us in love. So earth-based traditions, spiritual wisdom that grounds us, that locates the divinity of the divine love that you're talking about in our relationships with each other, and in our relationships to the earth, and in our relationships, period. You know, my grandmother from Ireland, who I learned so much about, I learned, you know, some traditional Irish stories from her and a little bit of the culture from her. She's from North Kerry. Something she always said was, all roads lead to God.
Mm-hmm.
I think James Cone, who's the Black liberation theologian, he talks about, you know, how we have to do away with the slave master's theology, the theology of the slave master and the colonizer. And so much of, we see that in the form of, a Christianity that was constructed not to spread this idea that God is love, but to be like, this is the, right God, right country, right skin color, and used as a justifying force for taking land, for murdering people who were different, and for enslaving people who were different. That's, the form of, the dominant form of Christianity in this country has that history. And it, of course, goes back to the doctrine of discovery, the papal bull that you were talking about. And yet, the Celtic Christianity of my grandmother, if you scratch the surface a little bit, at the center of it is this idea of God, what we call God as love, as all-inclusive love, as that is that which connects us, is that which is relatedness. And if we truly worship that life, then we have a spirituality, a faith of coming into relationship. And the earth-based traditions of the Celts really kind of, in many ways, syncretized and blended in some places and in certain contexts with the Christianity that of some in Ireland. And something I know of Celtic Irish storytelling is they talk about the sort of the mythical, semi-historical original people of Ireland who are the ancestors, or the Tuatha De Danann. This means the people of the goddess Danu. Erin itself in Ireland is the name of a goddess. And so literally the name of the earth, the land itself, is seen as a mother, as a goddess. So looking back into Irish ancestral narrative, we see the land is not something that we're owning, but that we're in relationship with. And we see this teaching this truth of the earth as our mother, and all living things as relatives. We can find this wisdom if we go back far enough in our ancestral narratives. And we need that wisdom. We need love to be a love that is located in mutual relationship. Well, love is mutual relationship. It's not abstract. So that's what I'm we need to have, whatever our spiritual tradition. I think when my grandma said all roads, all traditions lead to God, I think that that's what she meant. And I think we really need, I think that is what, if we allow that to be the container that holds our rage, holds our pain, holds our efforts to look back so we can go forward, I think that there might be hope. If we can't be carried by that, we're all in a great deal of trouble.
But I think we already have been. Like, we are love embodied. Like, and I mean that very, we are hope and love embodied. Like, yeah, I have, there was a Thomas Lloyd, I believe. There is an ancestor who I found. There were a couple Thomas Lloyds, and they all did things that my incarnation find abominable. There were a couple that fought against indigenous peoples. There were a couple that participated in chattel slavery. But there's also folks who in their human incarnation did really beautiful good things. And so they are the ones that I call on. They are the ones whose strength I hope to activate. But like, everyone who is breathing today comes from folks who suffered and had hope, and radical hope, for a future that they did not live to see. Like my grandpa, he was born, I believe in 1920 or so. He was born between world wars. He was born in Taiwan, a dark-skinned man, quite possibly with Aboriginal descent. People would call him Black Lee. In Taiwan, Taiwan is an Aboriginal island. The Portuguese and the Dutch literally brought Chinese men from the mainland to Taiwan to try and make it another exportation cash crop economy and do forced labor. And then the Chinese and the Aboriginal folks like banded together and kicked the colonizers out. But then the Chinese descendant people continued exploiting the folks who had more Aboriginal ancestry. Anyway, my grandpa, in the 1900s, after centuries of Taiwan being fought over by China, by Japan, by the French, by a bunch of different colonizing powers, he was born into that context. He lived through multiple world wars. After World War II, there was the Chinese Civil War. So Chiang Kai-shek, the communists and the nationalists were fighting, and then the losers, they came over to Taiwan and instituted martial law for decades, and my grandpa died before the end of martial law. He had hope that there would be a different kind of life for me, that I could have a life that was not so characterized by violence. And I am the embodiment in every breath, in every heartbeat of that hope, of that radical love. And it is in everyone. Like there's nobody, I do not believe there's anybody on this planet who every single one of their ancestors down to the single cell organism was a jerk, was an evil person. There was somebody somewhere who had a good heart. And that one person can be who we call on and say, how can I in this moment activate, reactivate, call on, invoke a lineage of justice? How can I change the legacy that I've inherited and make our name mean goodness, mean solidarity, mean integrity, mean reparations? And we don't even have to know their name, but given white supremacy, like there's a lot more documentation. So it's actually probably quite possible to do a little vision quest spiritual journey to try and find that person, find at least one person whose heart was good and who you can be like, I come from this person, and in the spirit of this love, I act with love, in solidarity, in hopes of a future with greater justice and with greater love. And I think that's kind of what I was coming from when I called you and said I wanted to have this conversation, because that's one of the many actions that I think white privileged folks who want to get into solidarity can do, to be sustainable allies in or co-conspirators in the work for justice. And it can be internal too, even if you don't have like access to the databases or the genealogy. Just listening inside to those who are in every cell, in every nucleotide. There is someone in there whose memory will invoke the radical love that can power sustainable justice work. I completely believe it's possible. Yeah,
I think it's possible too. And I think that, I believe that we're all, you talked about us being love embodied. I think that I think every human is capable of a range of every kind of behavior, from horrific evil to the potential of being that love embodied that you talked about. I mean, even the armed crazy racists, somewhere in there, I have to believe that there's the potential for being loving. But I think that our job is not to try to fix them right now, or I think it's to try to empower everyone else who's a little bit healthier to not be afraid to name oppression and be outraged at that which is morally outrageous and not try to problematize the outrage or the pain.
Yeah. Like, I mean, historically, like, it's very common, I think, for white liberals um, to reimagine in a historical way the Black freedom struggles and be like, oh, you know what? If I had been alive in the 60s, I would have been um, one of the quote unquote good ones. Like, I would have been
Right.
collaborating. And like I mean, I would say if you're not actively supporting Black Lives Matter and the indigenous land struggles that are happening right now at Wentz-Wenton, Mauna Kea, Mashpee Wampanoag, if you're not redistributing some of your wealth to the Dene, the Hopi, the Zuni Pueblo, no, like actually that's there have always been beneficiaries of systemic oppression. Like there's always been the clan folks, there's been the, you know, the one or two, I don't know, there's the couple John Browns, Harper's Ferry, like, yes, like actively taking solidarity. And, you know, the core members of the Congress of Racial Equality. But then honestly, it like inaction right now in a time when there are lynchings happening, I think it's so important to use that word lynching for this atrocity. When there is land theft happening, inaction is no, you know, you're definitely someone who in the Jim Crow South was saying to Martin Luther King when he was in the Birmingham jail that he was being too aggressive. Like that letter from Birmingham jail, he wrote it to white liberals.
Exactly. Yep. White clergy, I will add.
Yeah. I don't know, babe. Do you feel complete? Do you think this is sort of the message that we wanted to send out into the world today?
I absolutely. You're so brilliant. I love talking to you. I could talk to you all day, and I learned so much from you. I'm so grateful for your wisdom. And I mentioned that John O'Donohue blessing. I think that it would be maybe because I notice our time is kind of running short now.
Yeah, let's do it.
So maybe we can share just putting out some positive energy. I don't know if we could call it prayer or visualizing, whatever. Sort of, I can share something, and you can as well, and
Yes.
maybe we can finish that way.
Sounds good. I'm down. Let's do it.
But also before that, I'm wondering what are some action steps we can maybe suggest to anyone who might be watching this?
Yes, honey. 100%. So we've touched a lot about on the inner work. So like get on the internet, do some genealogy, write your feelings, cry it out, talk to a wonderful professional. There's a lot of therapists and psychiatrists who do telehealth because it's heavy, it's really hard. It's not Black people's work, but it's also not something that is really doable to do alone. There's lots of white folks and non-Black folks doing our work on our feelings in community. And then I probably will put this as a video with links to the petition for Ahmaud Arbery killers to be immediately arrested, the petition for the resignation of the DA who has still not arrested, as far as I know, the Travis and George McMichael. There's the email of the some sort of official that the Georgia NAACP asked folks to email this guy, I think Tony Duncan. And there's I'll share the link for the Mashpee Wampanoags their petition. I'll share the link for where you can get these shirts where all proceeds are going to the Mashpee Wampanoag because they have a lot of illegal fees. They're actually having to pay money to fight for their land, which they've inhabited. There's archaeological evidence of 12,000 years being on that land. But yeah, I'll sort of put together, I already have those links, I'll put them together. So there's the inner work, which is important, and also the outer work of leveraging your white privilege, calling your representatives, etc.
Wonderful. Yes. Well, I guess I just I have my Bridget cross here. The Saint Bridget is a character in Ireland. She was um, a goddess of warriors, healers, smiths crafts, poets, um, and she survived in the container, and she is the fire. And kind of the spirit of the people and all the women and the protector of children, and kind of represents the mother of Ireland. And her place in the home was always the hearth. And so I have her cross or her star above, and I have the fire here for her. And I have some water out here, and I'm going to dump that on the ground, on the earth later, in hopes of just putting out the fire of whiteness, putting out the fire of white supremacy that just keeps driving so much violence. I want to put out that fire. And so that's going to be part of the prayer. And in Ireland, also according to my grandma, when she was alive, we would always crown Mary together, because May was the month of Mary. When Christianity came to Ireland, there were people honored the mother, who I was talking about earlier, at wells. And so shrines to Mary went up all over Ireland around those wells. So there is a connection between Mary and the veneration of Mary and an ancient honoring of the divine feminine, which we need so much these days. It's interesting also to know that in the Hebrew, Mary, the name means rebellion. Oh
my God. Oh, yes, my love. Bring that into the conversation. Hey.
So may Ahmaud Arbery rise from the dead, and may he be risen from the dead, and may he be risen from the dead in our rebellion against the heinous evil and systems of oppression that led to his death. And may he be a star in Mary's crown, and may he be a flame everywhere that we see and feel in us everywhere. And with that, I'd like to just share this blessing for love in a time of conflict by John O'Donohue, who is someone who he was both a Celtic Christian theologian, but also he's a Dre. Dre is the Irish word for druid, Dre, the current Irish Gaelic. And this is called Love in a Time of Conflict, and he's a beautiful poet. And I don't see this as love in the sense of let's gloss over the rage or the pain or the hurt or jump to the forgiveness phase or anything like that. This is more the love that we were talking about a moment ago when we were talking about how we hope that all of our traditions point back to the love that holds us in mutual and justice making relationships. And so this is a blessing that love be the container of the rebellion, and love be the container of the healing and the rebellion that needs to take place. When the gentleness between you hardens and you fall out of your belonging with each other, may the depths you have reached hold you still. When no true word can be said or heard, and you mirror each other in the script of hurt, when even the silence has become raw and torn.
Feeling your feelings is radical, baby.
May you hear again an echo of your first music. When the weave of affection starts to unravel and anger begins to sear the ground between you, before this weather of grief invites the seed of bitterness to find root, may your souls come to kiss. Now is the time for one of you to be, well, I'll leave out the last stanza because I don't think we're there yet, but I think that those those words are a good blessing, that we all be held in love, and we all shed the tears that need to be shed, and we all speak the truths that need to be spoken, and give voice to the rage that deserves to be given its space.
Ashe. Yeah, and I think I'll do the golden radiant spirit invocation from the Taoist tradition. My Chinese name is Li Daoling. Dao is in Taoist, Dao is in the way. And the fact that I'm studying Taoism and Chinese medicine is one way that I'm trying to get out of that trap of cultural appropriation and go back to my ancestors' traditional medicine, and to come from that place and try to be of service from this place of ancestral connection. So this golden radiant spirit invocation talks about the cultivating throughout 100 million eons. It calls for all of our bodies to have a bright radiance. So it's a golden light protection around us. I particularly pray for this invocation to send that golden light of sacred protection to people of African descent and people of indigenous descent. It talks about 10,000 spirits prostrate and hold a ceremony. It says, the ghosts and demons lose courage. Evil spirits forget their forms. Within there are thunderbolts. The service of the thunderclap. So I pray for that transcendent justice to come. 天地传颂万气本根，光修一切增无神通，三界内外唯道独尊，体有金光，福音无声，视则不见，听则不闻，包罗天地，养育众生，诵其万遍，神有光明，三界是为无敌色音，万神朝礼，一息雷霆，鬼妖丧胆，精怪妄行，内有霹雳，雷声隐鸣，东为照彻，雾气腾腾，金光四现，复护真人，气气如如铃。Thank you, my love.
Thank you. Love you.